Hello and welcome to this video podcast on adaptive context analysis for Geneva Peace Week. Thank you so much for joining us for what we hope will be a really interesting and thought-provoking conversation. My name is Sarah Pickwick and I am the Senior Conflict Advisor at World Vision UK. And for those of you who aren't familiar with World Vision, we are a child-focused international charity specializing across humanitarian development, peace building, and also advocacy sectors. So thank you very much for joining us. In terms of setting the scene, just for why we've chosen to talk about this topic today, I think if we cast our minds back to at the end of 2019, I think already predictions into the year were already looking very grim. And I remember that Mark Lowcock, the head of the UN Office for Humanitarian Affairs, he had predicted that in 2020, 168 million people would need humanitarian assistance and protection. And that was the highest figure in decades due to a combination of a number of complex and global pressing issues, including climate change, intensifying conflict, disease outbreaks. And then you'll go into 2020 and you have the additional complexity of a global pandemic with COVID-19 now having the latest number of global cases, 35 million, over 1 million people who have lost their lives, and a lockdown and containment measures that have created an economic meltdown and has devastated the incomes of millions of people. And predictions, even at the lower end, are saying that 71 million people are now expected to be pushed back into extreme poverty. And the secondary impacts of the pandemic are going to be with us for many years. So with all of this complexity and uncertainty, the impact on the international development sector across all of the different spectrums has been one of adaptation, and context analysis as an aspect of what many of us do is no different to that. And so that is why we wanted to have this conversation today, because with the complexity of COVID and all of these other different issues, it is bringing us back to a fundamental question of why context analysis is needed in terms of this uncertainty and complexity and the volatility of regularly informing our interventions to be planned and delivered effectively to best serve the communities where we work, but also then the questions of how do you adapt? Is it possible to adapt? Who do you involve? When do you do it? What kind of platforms do you use? These are all kind of questions that we hope to touch on today, but also to look at the sort of more general initiative of context analysis and how it is commissioned, how it is utilized, and to have that reflection about the things that maybe we can still improve when context analysis is commissioned, and how it also is then useful when programming. So I hope that gives you a little bit of an appetite for what we're going to discuss. And I'm joined today by three people who bring a wealth of knowledge and experience in this area to have this conversation with me. So I'm joined by Leah Zamor, who is the Senior Policy Analyst and Head of the Humanitarian Crisis Program at the Center for International Cooperation, CIC, at New York University. And CIC, for those of you who don't know, is a research center that specializes in the links between peace, security, humanitarian, and development. I'm also joined by Musa Sangara, who is the Humanitarian Response Director for World Vision International, and by Johan Eldabo, who's the Regional Security Director for Southern Africa for World Vision International, and is also a visiting scholar at the CIC. So thank you to the three of you for joining me in this conversation. To those of you who are listening, just before we get started, we would love for you to send us your feedback and engage further with us at the end of this podcast. So we will be showing some more information, the email addresses of the speakers, our organization's websites and Twitter handles if you want to engage with us on social media, and also those of Geneva Peace Week. And also this video will be played, I believe, on YouTube, so you can put comments there. And if you have found us through the Geneva Peace Week app, then also all the links and email addresses will be in the information section for that, so you can also access it. And so you are very welcome to send us your comments, feedback, questions to continue this conversation, and we really look forward to further interaction with you. So without let's go then to this topic, very interesting topic. So I guess maybe a first question just to put out, and maybe Johan, I'll put this to you first. Is to maybe just give us your reflections on how COVID-19 has changed for you, how you understand the international development sector in terms of humanitarian development, peace building, And is context analysis to inform work in the sector even possible now, when you can't travel, when you can't listen to local voices? And so yeah, we'd be really interested to kick us off with some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I think, as you say in the introduction there, this year, in some ways, everything has changed for the world and for the humanitarian sector with COVID and with the lack of travel and with the growing needs, as you have described them. But at the same time, not that much has changed either, because the needs on how to do context analysis and the need to fully understand, or understand as much as we can what's going on where we work, is still there as it was before. So I mean, some of the principles that we have been following at World Vision when we try to understand context before are particularly three principles that have both changed and not with the advent of COVID-19. And the first one there is timeliness, is one we have looked at quite carefully for many years now, which essentially means that when we conduct analysis and we use it to inform decisions, then it needs to exist at the time when we make decisions. So it needs to be timely and actually be available when we need it. That hasn't changed, and that's still the case now. The second principle that we often look at is ownership, and to make sure that the analysis is owned both by the analysts who are actually conducting the work for it, but also by the decision makers who will then use it to make decisions and act upon it. But also, thirdly, by those communities that that live in the areas that we are actually analyzing. So when we have ownership across those, all those three categories, we tend to end up with good analysis that can actually lead to active decisions. And that leads to the third principle in there, which is practicality. If we want analysis to inform action that can actually happen, then the recommendations and the input and the output from the analysis needs to be practical enough to actually be used. So in some ways, all those principles are still valid now as they were before the pandemic started, but the way we reach them have had to change.
And so into the pandemic, bearing in mind those principles, can you tell us a bit about World Vision's context analysis journey and how you've had to adapt your tools in line with those principles, but I guess, yeah, what might be different in terms of the how?
Yeah, sure. One of the key elements that we have used for many of our context analysis tools over the last couple of years now, notably with our GCAR tool, which stands for Good Enough Context Analysis for Rapid Response, and our previous MSTC, Making Sense of Turbulent Context approach. Both of those principles have relied upon people traveling into areas, meeting people face to face, and holding workshops in person. That is no longer possible to the same extent as it used to be. So what we have done since the pandemic started is to adapt the GCAR approach to the GeoCAR approach, where the O stands for online, which essentially means that we have taken the principles and we have turned them into online methodologies and modalities for how to work. So instead of, for example, meeting people face to face for interviews, we can now send out surveys electronically, but that is possible. We can speak to people on the phone, and we can use programs like Zoom to host online workshops where that is possible as well. That does to some extent replace what we've done before, and it makes it possible to still conduct analysis. It does not give you the same type of conversations as you can have face to face, because online workshops can work and surveys can work. Meeting people for a cup of coffee is not the same when you do it online as opposed to doing it in person. So that in-person coffee break that often gives nuance and detail and builds trust and relationships with people, that component is no longer as easy to do. But that having analysis is still important enough that we need to do what we can to make that happen. And that's why we did the modification and why we're still using it now.
Yes, and hence the phrase good enough. So yes. Great, thank you. Musa, maybe just to come to you to give us maybe a few more examples from your experience. Maybe some examples from some of the contexts that you've worked in, particularly the fragile contexts, that have benefited from doing online context analysis, and before that, other context analysis. And yeah, from you, whether you sort of those principles and how they've outworked your experience.
Yeah, on the benefits, I think, as Johan was mentioning, not much has really changed unless, except the fact that we have had to go and use digital technology to actually get the same exercise done because of the restriction of movement in the various countries. I think for the benefits, we can mention at least the first thing is being able to still collect information and conduct the analysis using digital technology. The second benefit is that it sort of forces us to innovate and actually work with other partners in a collaborative manner because only one organization does not have all the information, and therefore you need to bring the other partners, the government, the local community into the conversation to be able to actually have a comprehensive set of information that will help with the decision making. And based on experience with West Africa, I can actually tell you that it has been really a good enough set of information that we were able to use to make decisions, particularly during the height of the pandemic, where there was not only a restriction of movement due to armed conflict, but also restriction of movement due to some of the measures taken to try to protect the local communities. And so bringing that, the GeoCar into play as one of the mechanism was really instrumental in helping determine the actual situation on the ground, particularly looking at the impact on the households of the restrictions taken, but also of COVID-19, and being able to actually adapt the ongoing programs and prioritize the activities around, safeguarding communities, protecting the most vulnerable, and also protecting the livelihoods of people. So it was really instrumental in helping get to that level of decision making, and also keeping the donors informed and the beneficiaries as well. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that holistic approach in terms of drawing in a multiple actors has and that collaboration, yeah, is actually key. And then, yes, as you said, very much the how you translate that into action being also another key thing that isn't, isn't new to the context analysis conversation. Leah, maybe I can come to you just as we sort of then maybe zoom out about Moose's point on donors and the wider use of context analysis, but maybe how also it's commissioned. There are some who are skeptical, I guess, about the intent and the capacity of the international community to sincerely conduct and utilize context analysis because they feel that their worldviews do not properly account for their own place in the context analysis. So I'm interested to hear, what do you think about this viewpoint? And what would you say are possible remedies and opportunities for the whole initiative to kind of improve and land better?
Well, thank you. That's a very, very interesting question. First, just thanks. I'm delighted to be here and joining and somewhat crashing the World Vision meeting. I want to start by saying I think it's, to kind of commend World Vision for what I think is a really positive step. So on two levels. So one is that you've really prioritized context analysis, and that hasn't stopped even amid the pandemic, with all the repercussions and knockoff effects that, Sarah, that you mentioned in the opening. And two, that you're still committed to bringing in local voices, which I think is perhaps the number one most important part of context analysis, and one of the ones that's the hardest to do. And it's especially hard to do now. So I really just want to put that out there and say, well done. And I look forward, as many I think will, to learning more about GeoCar and how other organizations can learn from your experiences in that regard. Zooming out a bit, I would say that there's still, you know, as Johan said, everything has changed and nothing has changed. And I think that's true broadly. I think it's also true just zooming into analysis and the analytical landscape. And we've mentioned sort of the importance of local voices. I would say that equally important is these kind of the global forces that actually create or perpetuate crises, which have often been left out of analytical processes that tend to focus in on sort of the direct impacts and the local impacts and a kind of national context. So I'll mention two, which I think remain sort of blinders analytically during COVID and before it, but hopefully not after it. So one is just the lack of historical awareness that is ongoing. Some of my colleagues at CIC just produced a report about the response to Ebola, which was another sort of, you know, very infectious disease. And they were specifically looking at Democratic Republic of Congo. And what their report really makes clear is that you can't understand either the spread of Ebola in Congo or the response to it without understanding the legacy of colonialism. And that's not something that most humanitarian analyses or even, you know, more broadly out of the humanitarian sphere captures. Those kinds of legacies, those kinds of global forces, which, as they show very well, had enormous impact both on the spread of the disease and on the response to it. And so how do we, within this moment of so much complexity and so much acceleration of needs, actually step back a bit and say, we can't actually respond well to this pandemic in a context like Yemen or in a context like DRC without understanding those kinds of global forces. And then the other one I would mention is just the need for stronger political economy analysis. That so much of what perpetuates sort of humanitarian crises and humanitarian needs are things like the lack of fiscal capacity of the government, or what is the social contract in a particular state? What is the relationship and the role of the state? Things like the debt crisis, which I think some of us were worried about for a number of years and now is front and center. And we can't really understand how governments are responding to this pandemic in humanitarian context without understanding these kind of more macro issues. So as important as it is and as vital as it is, and I would agree that it's kind of the most important thing that we get local voices involved in analytical processes, we can't forget that so much of what happens in humanitarian context is actually external to that context, and we need analysis that captures those.
Yeah. So I guess looking forward, maybe a sort of final thing to put to each of you is, for those who are listening in, if you were to sort of put one final question to them or comment or one thing that you would like people to take away in terms of this conversation around continuing to do adaptive context analysis and trying to reflect on it and improve it, what would be, I guess, the one thing you would like to leave our listeners with? So Johan, maybe I'll go to you first and then I'll come to you, Musa, and then finish with Leah.
Sure, thank you. I think one of the key things that both Leah and Musa have mentioned as well is the importance of listening to the right people. And one angle what that comes in from is that one thing we try to do with context analysis is to clarify what's going on and to create some level of confidence in our understanding of what's happening around us. But at the same time, one thing we do need to learn as we listen is to learn to tolerate the inevitable ambiguity that will still remain at the end of that listening. Because we'll try to find all the answers that we can and try to make sure that there is no confusion left, and design lots of processes to get towards that point and collect data towards that end. But at the end of the day, there will still be confusion and there will still be ambiguity and uncertainty. Because things change so rapidly and things are so complex that we can't get to full clarity, regardless of how well we try to do that. But that means we have to actually learn to live with it and to manage it in a way that we can still be effective as organizations and try to do what we need to do to support the most vulnerable who live in some of the most volatile and uncertain environments. But culturally, from an organizational perspective and from the humanitarian community angle, tolerating that type of ambiguity is as essential for protecting our staff and keeping us safe where we work as it is towards accomplishing our goals in terms of meeting the needs of those who are in need of support.
Tolerating ambiguity. Yeah, no, absolutely. Musa, what would you like to leave people with?
Right, Sarah. I think we can agree that we have arguably, the humanitarian community in this case, have managed to have good field assessment, joint field assessment in this case, and also project level assessment done very well. But one area that I think where we need to still strengthen is on adaptive context analysis. And for me, I think one message is that we need to engage in further partnership and collaboration with all the stakeholders, from government to beneficiaries to humanitarian organizations. We also need to bring in the private sector and also the scholars, all the, the research institutions that are there to try to actually work together in making sure that we bring all the necessary expertise in one place to coordinate not only the data collection, the analysis, and the decision making. I think if we begin to work like that as a humanitarian community towards, supporting humanitarian development, peace building, we will be able to actually bring the nexus to life in our work, but we will also have a common voice that can be presented to the donors and to the various, bilateral partners that are willing to support. And I think it's actually arguably one of the key areas that we need to strengthen. If people don't understand what we are doing and how we are doing it together, it will be difficult for them to trust us and actually provide the appropriate support.
Absolutely, yeah, that call for collaboration and a shared understanding, yeah, absolutely being key for many different benefits. Yeah, thank you. Leah, finally.
Sure. Well, no, I mean, I absolutely reiterate what Johanna Musa just said. I smiled, I think, each time you guys mentioned GeoCar as good enough analysis, because that has to be the standard. You're never going to get perfect analysis, especially in very fluid, complex, often dangerous situations. I will, though, add that I think that, the not just the humanitarian community, but sort of more the aid community more generally also needs to accept a bit that crises are often actually quite predictable, that we know that there will be drought, for instance, in the next 2, 3, 5 years in the Horn of Africa, that that we don't know exactly when or where or the extent, but that we can actually predict, and therefore we can act earlier if we have that analysis. So getting the kind of analytical landscape to also be a bit more preemptive and preventative, I think, would be extremely helpful in motivating and justifying more early interventions, would be sort of one point I would make. The other one is just that we need analysis to be prioritized, that it's often not glamorous. It's not very visible. It's not actually directly saving lives, but everything that comes after it stems from it. So if we don't have a good understanding of the problem, we're not going to have good solutions to that problem, which means, for instance, that donors and agencies and NGOs and everybody involved needs to really prioritize analysis. And that, I think, is more important now than ever in this kind of context where COVID is not just a health crisis, but an economic crisis and a political crisis, and of course, a humanitarian crisis. The other one would be that there just needs to be an investment in institutional memory. And this sort of gets to the predictability that that a lot of times there's a wealth of knowledge, but it's not often accessible to the people who need it, and but it already exists, and that I think is about incentives and funding, and a lot of the kind of internal sort of bureaucratic politics of the aid sector, where this is actually quite hard, that it's not easy for agencies to have at their ready what their predecessors a decade ago, for instance, might have already learned. And so there's a lot of reinventing the wheel that often happens. And then I just want to absolutely reiterate this idea of collaboration, that no agency and no sector knows everything or should know everything or have the expertise to know everything. And so if you can bring together the political and the development and the humanitarian to do an analysis, you're going to have a much more comprehensive understanding of the problem, but you're also then going to have a basis to go to in a humanitarian setting to the development folks and to the political folks and say, you're involved in this, as you can see from this analysis, that we need, we need political and diplomatic support, and we need development, and we need all of these other things to come together in a place in order to solve the problem. And that, again, it starts with the analysis. If you have an analysis that's focused predominantly on humanitarian needs, that's going to lead you in one direction. But if you broaden it, then you're going to have both a stronger understanding of the problem and the basis to actually bring in those other actors.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of comes back to the point that we started, which is a reminder of the value of context analysis in terms of being that foundation that hopefully will inform our decision. But yes, very much taking your point around it being collaborative in order to maximize the impact, and investment in the institutional memory as well. Absolutely, yeah, brilliant point. Great. Well, thank you so much to the three of you for this really interesting conversation, and to those who are listening, I hope it's given you a little bit of a taste of these issues. And so, just again to encourage, if you'd like to follow up with us, I'll just now be sharing some links on the screen. So it's the email addresses of each of us if you'd like to get in touch with any questions, comments, or feedback, as well as our websites for our organizations, our Twitter handles. And so please do get in contact with us. And there's also a variety of links of articles from the different authors that hopefully you can read for further information. So I will just display that now, and just to say thank you so much for listening to our podcast, and we look forward to further engagement.